Thank you everyone for being here today. For those of you who are joining us online, I listened to Bob Work's comments earlier in the day, and then you've had three very good panels talk about the different types of reform. So I'm going to back cleanup, going to walk through some of them. Feel free when we get to the Q&A section at the end, if you want to ask me if I think the audit is a good idea, throw the pitch over the plate. I'll be happy to take a swing at it, as well as some of the other discussions that come up. But what I want to do in closing is focus on three questions and then talk about the way ahead. And the first question is, why is this so hard? Why is it so hard to drive change in a federal bureaucracy or inside the Department of Defense? And once you get done understanding how hard it is, the question was, then why is it worth the effort? Why should we try and spend their time and energy rolling the rock up the hill as Sisyphus would do, chasing like Don Quixote? And then the last one is, what are the changes that we're seeing that are going to create new opportunities for us to make DoD more efficient? And then I'm going to talk at the end about, if you're going to go ahead and undertake reform, what are my recommendations to you as to how to go about doing that to maximize your chance of success? So first of all, the question is, why is this so hard? And the answer is, it's actually built into the system. The things that are the strength of why you set up a federal bureaucracy the way you are is because it does stability and compliance. And if there's two things that make it difficult to change, stability and a compliance focus are it. But that's what you create them for. That's why we stand them up. No one says, I want to innovate something, let me give it a bureaucracy, right? But if they said, how do I make sure this happens every day the same way it did yesterday? That's what the bureaucracy does for you. In the private sector, when they have this tension, they recognize they can go out of business. So there was always an effort that even when the bureaucracy wants to run a certain way, they either have to change or they die. Inside the United States government, our changes and pressures are actually very different, because the values that come to some of these issues actually reinforce the nature of your bureaucracy to resist change. So for example, when a private sector awards a contract or hires a person, it's thinking, how do I do this in the way that maximizes the success, the profitability of my firm? In the federal government, when we award a contract, we ask ourselves, as I give out this money, how do I make sure that every firm had a fair chance to compete for it? If I'm going to open this job, how do I make sure that every potential employee had a fair chance to compete for it? Those values are very different than simply trying to maximize the benefit for the company that's setting it up. And so when they clash, what loses is speed. When you have a question about an employee, an application for a job in a private firm, you need the person on board in a week or two in order to do the mission. So you open the announcement up for a couple of days, you interview the people you saw in that window, and you hire. In the federal government, we open the window up long enough to give everyone a chance to see it and to apply. We sometimes take several months to go through this process. Now, that is not in the best interest of the government. Frequently, it's not in the best interest of the employee, but it's a fair process that's compliant with the procedures we put in place that emphasize the maximum chance of compliance with the process. And we do the same thing with contracting. Contracts get protested over process. They get investigated by GAO over process. You don't get someone who bings you and says, we're unhappy with it because it took you so long to award. The vendors sometimes do, but that's not a process violation. The other challenge we have is the way accountability comes in. Accountability comes in for not following the procedures. And when often you don't follow the procedures, the recommendation is additional procedures or an organization to do oversight to see whether or not you could comply with the procedures the next time around. And so, GAO is often criticized when they come in and the auditors say, why are you holding me to tough standards? GAO goes, we're not. We grabbed your manual with your procedures and we judged you against it, and you're not following all your procedures. And people don't like that, but it's true. And many of the procedures you have in government are not within your control to change. Many of them are in legislation or other things, which creates an exceptional set of additional wrinkles that I'll get to in a second. Fourth problem is the Department of Defense is legitimately complex. It is an enormous organization. And if you think you can just grab out this Jenga piece and have no consequences, we have seen what happens when people try and do that. And the consequences are pretty ugly. Think of the scale. Delta is the third largest airline. They have 800 planes. We have more attack helicopters in DoD than that. We have 3 to 4 times more fighter aircraft than that, never mind tankers, refuelers, bombers, and the others. So imagine the Defense Logistics Agency's supply problem, trying to make sure it has enough of the right spare part of the wheels to go on those planes and the variety of platforms it has to deal with. or the millions of pay transactions, like 137 million that DFAS does every year to pay vendors and people and other sorts of things, and the complicated rules that come with them because we keep adjusting the formulas. And because they're often part of the law, they're hard to change. What makes DOD so impressive, right? There was a missionary captured in northern Nigeria, October 31st, 2020. DOD goes all the way across the world, shows up, pulls them out. Think of all the things it did to take and train and equip a unit to be able to do that. To be able to go that far around the world with refueling and everything else, to show up in the middle of nowhere with sensors and whatever they needed, and you want to tinker with that process. People get legitimately concerned. And if you don't understand what you're touching, you're like the person who reaches into an old style watch and says, I'm going to make it more efficient by pulling out 5% of the parts. That would be my savings. And then wondering why it didn't quite work the way you hoped when you set it up. The last part, the fifth one, is everyone gets to play. If you've ever read Peter Levine's guide, you'll notice the notion that you don't actually get to make a decision in the Department of Defense is quite true. Everyone else gets to decide whether they like your opinion, and because we're a democracy, find 16 different ways from OMB to the Hill to see if they can adjust, advise, or require further study on your decision before it goes forward. So you may think that the cost-benefit calculation is quite clear, but the cost-benefit calculation of the other people from their perspective may be very different. And therefore, the reforms, the people who are going to lose out know who they are and will speak up. And those, like the general taxpayer who benefit, don't necessarily see it or speak. So you're always going into headwind, right? It's not like you're trying to walk down the street. It's like you're trying to gain 5 yards and there's 11 people out there on the field whose job is to tackle you. It makes it much more challenging to drive reform. So keep in mind the system we're trying to change, any bureaucracy left to its own devices, when it makes the mistake, will develop more controls, become more rigid, create a more complicated process, and tends to move slower unless you change it. And the last part about the reform, as I've talked about all the hurdles, keep in mind, if you were to come into a new administration, say this administration, let's suppose you confirmed by June or July, which would be pretty fast, meant you're one of the few people who got in. You then see this reform you want to do, and you realize it needs a legislative change. So you work out the legislative change, and you manage to get it to the guys inside General Counsel in time, which is about September, about now. It goes through their vetting, it goes through OMB. OMB loves it for some reason. It goes to the Hill. You go up to the Hill, you explain it to the authorizers and the appropriators, the Republicans and the Democrats, the House and the Senate. Everyone thinks it's a wonderful idea. It goes into whichever is the appropriate vehicle, and given the current cycle, about December, it gets enacted. You have now been in your job 18 months, and you finally have the legislative change you need to begin to implement the reform you liked, except the average political appointee's tenure is 18 months. So you have pretty much set up the person after you, assuming they care about the same things you do and are willing to dedicate their life to the reform that you thought of. So with all of this wonderful headwind coming at you, it really begs the question, why does anybody attempt reform? Because you know you're going to get the beating, right? There's an old Caribbean t-shirt that says the guy's lying in the hammock and the phrase is nobody move, nobody get hurt. There's some advantage of that in politics. It reinforces that style. So here's the couple of reasons why. The first one is it's the taxpayers' money. And there's no other way to look at this without understanding the obligation we have to treat that money seriously. So when we get to year-end close, and I was in the Department of Defense, I used to remind people, look, if you're going to post those last obligations at year-end with the money that didn't get spent, assume it was $250,000, which would be a relatively small transaction at year-end. Think of what you're about to buy and imagine walking down the street of your hometown, 8 houses on the left, 7 houses on the right, and you say to them, here's what I did with everything you are going to pay in taxes for the next year. Are they going to like your decision? Are they going to be enthusiastic about that expenditure? So we need to remember that when we talk about some of these savings, we say it's just $1 million. It's $1 million. That's pretty cool. We need to push on those savings. The second thing is it's really rewarding. If you've ever been in government and you've had the chance to reform something, it becomes more efficient. It's really cool. This is why I'm in government. This is why I was in government. This is what came in. Most of my life, I've been a career civil servant. Later at the end, I was political. In between, I took 2 steps to the private sector, 8 years with a CPA firm, currently with a law firm. Covington is a law firm. Carney is a CPA firm. Neither a lawyer nor an accountant, just so we're clear. I have to say that in my statements. I'm a non-lawyer. but you get to see things from a different direction. And so when I came in 1989, 1990, hired by the Army and to be a budget analyst in their intelligence community. And they had a very cumbersome process for deciding how to allocate the budget. So I was young and didn't know better. And I wrote a memo to the leadership. Hey, I did an analysis. Here's a way you could revise the process to be more efficient. And lo and behold, they said, okay, good idea. You put it in. And we did. So we speeded it up. We changed some things. We reduced the workload. You can ask me about this in the Q&A, but I won't take the time here. But at the end of it, the SES took me aside and said, you've saved us $1 million a year on an IT contract we got to end. I was making $24,000 a year. And somebody said, you got to save us $1 million, 40 times what I earned. So I was hooked, right? So when you do this stuff, keep in mind the consequences of reform, even the small ones, is savings, and it's really exciting to be able to be part of. So those are the two. One is you have a moral obligation to do it. The second is it's really fun when you do get to do it. So it's exciting and it's like addictive and you should. The third is actually much more time sensitive, which is the national security environment is changing. The threat is changing, technology is changing, the character of warfare is changing, and speed and innovation matter. Now, one can always say this has always been true, and to some extent that's the case, but the US economy in World War II was significantly larger than Germany or Japan's. During the Soviet Union and the Cold War, our economy was significantly larger than Russia. So at the end of the day, we could spend more and beat them in the end. But right now, that's not the case with China. Their population is several times the size of ours. And while their GDP isn't the same, according to the World Bank, when you account for purchasing power, the inflation and so forth, it is. It's on par with ours. Their technology is in some cases ahead, or in others, they're stealing to stay close. And their budget and defense is growing 6 to 8% a year. So while we have a lot of advantages as the United States, we do not have the same margin of error that we did in the past. They have numerically more ships. Ours are larger, ours are more capable, but China is the top ship producing nation in the world by tonnage and is increasing its shipbuilding capacity and capability for all naval classes. The gap is closing. They've also invested in what we call the anti-access aerial denial strategy with long-range strike, 1,250 ground-launched ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Until the United States left the INF Treaty, we had 0. So when Deputy Secretary Hicks during the budget rollout said, quote, China, and described China as our pacing threat, and that it is the economic, military, and technological capability to challenge the international system and American interests within it. This is not hyperbole. This is what we're up against. This is the thing we have to face. This is why the Joint Staff is working on the joint warfighting concept to be able to deal with this. This is why the previous administration at its last budget announced it was the largest RDT&E budget ever with an investment in hypersonics, AI, electronic warfare, cyber, and space. And the new administration in their first budget said, again, the largest RDT&E budget ever, and the same list of initiatives. And if you ever pull the string on back of Bob Work and he talks about the third offset, you will hear those same technologies. Why? Because the nature of warfare is changing. And technology is changing how we fight, and the country that figures out how to combine those differently to produce the best effect will be in a dramatically different position. So how do we get back to management reform? How is this RIF relevant? The answer is, when you change the way an organization fights, you change its personnel process, you change its acquisition process, you change its budgeting financial process. And those processes either reinforce the emphasis on speed and innovation, or they smother it. And we have an obligation to make sure that we're working with the Department of Defense, that those processes reinforce and accelerate those changes instead of smothering it. Okay, so what are the opportunities coming up for reform? Well, first of all, we always can look across a process, and just like any process over time, it develops barnacles. What do we need to do to improve it? So over the previous few years, there was major emphasis on acquisition reform, and a lot of changes were put in there. And what we see coming up next is an emphasis from the House and the Senate on PPBES. And so we'll be able to see some changes there in order to drive a more improved and more responsive process. We've also seen technology give us new opportunities, and in particular, data analytics, everything from artificial intelligence to bots. And I don't remember if they covered bots much in the previous one, but basically microcodes of software that allows you to go through and do repeatedly what a person used to do. So you want to find a file somewhere in your system with a contract code, it can run through all the systems and pull it for you And an individual doesn't have to do that time, so it speeds it up. Bob Work described this in his opening comments as the key to driving reform in the future. But let's move a step back on the chessboard. Why did we undertake the audit in 2017? In order to make this future possible. In order to do data analytics, you need accessible and accurate data at the transaction level in order to analyze it. You have to have the raw material for your data analytics tools. And the audit is the foundation that made that possible. It's not the financial statement. There are benefits to the financial statement. There's some uses of it. But the audit requires you, in order to even undergo the audit, to assemble a data set of every transaction your organization engaged in, not just your business financial transactions, inventory, real property. What are your assets? Where are they located? Do you have them accounted for? In order to do this, the Department of Defense created a universe of transactions. All the business transactions across the department need to be pulled into place where the auditors could pull a sample and say, it says here, you bought JDAMs, 100 of them on this date. Where are they? Show me them in your inventory. Prove to me that you still have them and that you paid the vendor the right amount. If you can do that, you can pass the audit. Excuse me. If you can't, you have a problem. So they did this, and what we discovered early on in the Department of Defense was that a lot of our data isn't stored at the transaction level. The Army would block obligate under its budgetary data several hundred million for payroll. We'll figure it out later what the actual numbers came, but that seemed like a pretty good estimate. You can't do data analytics on a block obligation because it's just a single thing. It loses and hides all the things behind it. The audit forces people to break that down. If you want to be able to ready for the audit, give me individual level transactions. We also had stovepipe systems, individual systems no one wanted to talk to. Audit says I have to be able to see it. So the answer is you got to be able to share it if we're going to go play this game. So you start to get that data. You also have to clean it up, convert it into a place that can be sorted and analyzed. So under Advantage, some great work was done to be able to not only bring in that data, but find where the underlying data was missing key data fields, correct it, put it in a sortable format and store it. And then layered on top is a whole series of data analytic tools, which allows you to see data in a way you never could before if you were using a tool like Excel. And when I talk about this, I'm not talking about something that's on the horizon. One day when we get a clean opinion, we'll get to do this. This is what the department is doing right now. 23 billion transactions are in its Advantage data system, pulled from at least 220 data sources, 18,000 users. Now, I recognize I've been out of the department for a couple of months now. I think those numbers have all jumped since then, and so people will give you more up to date. But even that shows you the scale. Bob Work, when he was up here, he complained. He said, when I was in the DMAG, we'd have PowerPoint slides. And it was true. When I got to the Department of Defense, we'd do our monthly review of performance, and there would be these PowerPoint slides produced by some action officer over a very long set of weekends. I feel sorry for them. Pulled from systems whose data was now several months old, brought up to the department. And when we had a question, you couldn't click on the PowerPoint slide because it didn't do anything to you. You had to go ask somebody and they had to go pull it back. Before I left, we had eliminated PowerPoint in our monthly reports. We brought up Advantage. We looked at the actual inventory, the actual data from the system. We had a question, we drilled down. I see that's the aggregate number. Can you break it out by service? Can you split it up by command? You started to see the spike wasn't in the department. The spike was in a specific organization and everybody else didn't have a problem. Now you knew what the real issue was you were dealing with. So we saved all the labor of all those individuals who kept producing PowerPoint formats because it formatted automatically. The data was much more timely and we were looking at real information and we could queue it to tell us if something changed, if you wanted to have a dashboard on your desk. We didn't just use this here, we use this in COVID, where we brought in not only our internal data, but external data. So every commander of a base could see what's the current presence of COVID in a 50 or 100 mile radius around my base. What's the fill rate of hospital beds at the hospitals near my base and the one on my base? What is the rate of fill of the ICU beds outside or inside? And they could adjust the readiness levels that they needed to be at. They could see the inventory they had for masks and everything else, all in an organized way, pulled from all the disparate systems without the need for the ever-loving data call that we like to do in the Department of Defense. I'd like to know how many masks we have. Can somebody do me a data call and tell me in 30 days, right? And we'd pull past that. There's a couple of advantages to all of this. The first is clean data is faster and cheaper. Because if you have to keep re-entering the data, you generate errors. So the only way to pass the audit is to stop doing that. to get it in right at the beginning and keep it going through. More importantly, Archimedes used to say, give me the lever and the place to put it and I'll move the earth. The audit is the constant pressure on the Department of Defense that says, is your ACT system inventory accurate? That's a simple question. You say you have this in inventory. Is it true? You say you have this many buildings on your property books. Is it true? You say you can't stop sharing the data when there's an audit. The moment you stop, you have a problem. So all of those pressures continue to drive the department to better, cleaner data, but you don't have to wait on the audit to be complete to benefit from it. So I talked about major process, majored about technology driven. The other thing you're going to have as an opportunity to drive reform is what I'll call areas of surprise, where something comes up where there's a crisis and you have to change. And the example of this is last year with Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed was faced with the need to try and develop a vaccine for COVID when the historical norm was very long and the fastest it had ever been done is 4 years. And they managed to get it down to 1. And I'll talk a little bit in some later about how they did that. But just imagine we were under the old system. We'd have another 2.5 years to go before anyone was going to get their first jab and what that would mean to the functioning of this country. So when we talk about reform, sometimes the answer is you have to get reform going because the nation has no other choice and it drives it. So there's another set of opportunities on what I think are the places that change is going to come. But the conflict for this session is the future of defense reform. And I'd like to suggest that the future of defense reform is you. Those of you who are watching, those of you who are here, those of you who are either civil servants in the government who make this happen every day, or those of you who may go serve in the government as part of an administration, you are going to have the opportunity to drive change. You are going to get to look at all those obstacles and decide, do you take this on or do you let it go by because it's just too hard? So I would encourage you, it doesn't have to be enormous, large and small, all of it matters. Savings are real. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about reform, not, we do budget drills all the time. We've done them a lot in my life. We're very good. Those are prioritizations, right? I only have $100. I needed 110. What am I not going to do? What I'm talking about is the reform when you take a process that worked one way and you change it to function a different way because it's faster, cheaper, or better. And there's a lot of ways to measure efficiency, but that's the type of change bureaucracies have a hard time with. And it's the type of change that really requires strong leadership. So if you are going to do this, this is not a believe in yourself, I think I can type of message, because you can push yourself on rock climbing. But if you don't know what you're doing, you are just going to plummet to your death. You didn't make a difference in the world. You just made a dent. So what I want to talk to you about is how not to make a dent, but to make a difference, because it's a lot more fun. So let's go over this. So the first recommendation I would have for you to start with is ask a lot of questions. Before you take on a reform, talk to people. First of all, there's a really good chance we studied it or somebody studied it and there's a whole bunch of analysis behind it and you can save yourself a lot of time by reading it. You'll engage with people who know a lot more about it than you do, who have lived this process for years, who know why things are the way that they are. You may even discover that you're looking at the wrong problem. So we often talk about PPBS and people say it's like the Soviets, it's a 5-year system. Is it? Is that its problem? Or is it the problem that it's a 1-year system that goes over and over again and doesn't properly look out 5 years? Because your solution is different depending on what you think is the actual problem. I had an opportunity to learn this firsthand in one of my early assignments in management as at Menwith Hill Station. And as I found useful to do, I took one of the documents that would go through our office and I just hand carried it to each person. Who does it go to first? What do you do with it? What do you do with the next? And I followed it. So I saw what happened inside my organization. I later learned to call this A123 test of design, test of operating effectiveness. But in the process, I came across this lovely woman who would certify that there are funds available and approve the transaction, who had a computer, and next to it, she had a manual version of the same thing. And she would write out in the data set, every time a transaction came through, who it was for, what the amount was, what the new balance was, and then she'd enter it in the system, and then she'd approve it. And my first reaction was, oh, what a Luddite. Here I've got someone where the government spent all this money to bring the modern technology, and they're still doing it by hand because they can't let go of the old system. But I remembered the warning, which is ask a lot of questions. So I did. I said, why do you do it this way? And she said, well, people need to travel. We have acquisitions, we have contractors to pay. And sometimes the computer system goes down for 3 days at a time. And by having the ledger, I know there's funds available. I can certify, I can move the money. When the system comes back up, I just stay a little later and catch up. I didn't have a personnel problem. I had an IT problem. That person did great customer service. That person went above and beyond to make sure that those things didn't stay in our office. She had an IT system that was terrible. But I would not have assumed that that was the problem when I stood at a distance and looked. So engage with those who will be affected. Do they see a problem? If you want to drive reform and be successful, it really helps if the process you're trying to reform has people in it who think it's broken, who think it needs to be improved. And if you can design it in a way that benefits them, you're going to get a lot more support for the change you're trying to put into place. So you think about the universe of transactions that I talked about earlier that you had to build for the audit. As Bob Works said in his opening remarks, data sharing in the Department of Defense, quote, is an unnatural act. And you think about it, if you go to people and say, please tell me and share your data with me, you may get a cringed response if you come from management, or if you come from a place like CAPE, where they're afraid of what you're going to do with the data to them. So we did a couple of things. First of all, we approached them with accountants who are generally less threatening and don't carry sharp objects, or at least don't appear to. But also we thought about how to make it that sharing the data with the department was to their advantage. And so when we brought in the department, we made the tools to analyze the data available to those who were sharing their information with the department. So for example, the Army found it easier to do an analysis on their budget by going into the department system and using the department's data analytic tools to look for dormant accounts or many of the other changes that they went through, because we had reformatted the data in a certain way. We presented them with data analytic tools. And so the folks from Advanta had really made it to their benefit. So a lot of organizations were more willing to share. One is because I told them it was the law and you had to, but apparently that doesn't always move everyone as quickly as you'd like. But also because it became clear to those who did how much benefit their organization had. And we as the department, when I was in it, had to be careful to not try and use this as a weapon, but to allow it to be a tool for them. I give you the data analytics so you can run your budget better, not necessarily so I can second guess or try and get there ahead of you. The Army found that tremendously valuable. They were great to take advantage of it. Other organizations quickly followed through. The other things you learn when you ask questions is little hiccups that if you didn't appreciate them, you would have been stumbling later on. So for example, we wanted the auditors to help us find the problems. But in a normal audit, when the auditors find you're not going to pass, they go pens down, right? They say in a financial statement audit, commercial audit, federal audit, they'll keep going. But in a commercial audit, they generally want to save you money. They say, you're not going to pass, we're going to stop. We had to know that to realize that we needed the IG to write the contracts in a way that said, don't stop when you find a problem. Keep going. What we're paying you to do is to find as many problems as possible so that the Department of Defense can set about to fix them. And then when you come back the next year, you can let us know whether or not our fixes worked. Because part of the problem we had pre-audit is we never knew if we had fixed it. We did the change, but there was no sign off by the auditor. So that gets from my first question to ask questions to my second observation, which is scout out for obstacles, expect them, look ahead. This is leadership. There's a reason our combat units have a recon element. You need somebody going ahead and finding out what's going to hit you later on so you can plan for it in advance. And when that bad news comes to you, don't shoot the messenger. They didn't create the problem. They found it for you. So the answer to them is, thank you. Thank you for pointing out this problem that's now going to ruin my weekend, but I was going to see it. I wish wasn't going to see it till later. So at least now we can do something about it. Here's a similar example with DoD. We have not only financial statements, we have classified data. And the challenge is these seem to be a little bit at odds. Classified data means I don't want you to see it. And financial data is I'm trying to disclose it to you. And what you do when you have to do with both of those at the same time. Well, we have an accounting board, FASAB, who helps us solve these issues, but we realized they didn't have clearances. So we couldn't even explain to them the problem that we needed guidance from them on. And God bless them, they went ahead and got clearances. And so when we went to them and said, how would you like us to account for X? They could tell us. But if we had waited until we hit the problem, we would have lost a year waiting to go through the whole security clearance process, which is a whole story of its own on management reform. But that gets to the challenge of if you can see a problem enough in advance, you often can take the steps to fix it before it's right in front of you. And if you wait until you get kicked by the rake each time, this is going to be a very, very slow process. This was also came up with Operation Warp Speed. You know, we all remember the vaccine, how it came out in December and January and people got vaccinated. Well, the answer is if you wanted to get a vaccine and you needed hundreds of millions of them out, you also needed hundreds of millions of syringes. So General Perna and his team, well before we got to the end state of this situation, had gone backwards and looked at the supply process and said, what chemicals does a vaccine company need to have access to produce a vaccine in quantity? What equipment do they have to increase capacity? Where do we get syringes from? Where do we buy them? And so they started addressing all of those items. So you never saw those shortfall news stories. I mean, we could have had very exciting news stories about how we have all this vaccine and no way of delivering it, right? Or the vaccine production stopped while they waited on supplies that they didn't have. General Perna and his team at Operation Warp Speed were constantly looking ahead, and they were the reason why you never saw any of those stories. And so huge success on their part. I would encourage you to make this a part of any reform that you do. Vice Chairman Hyten and I used to have a meeting once a week. We're simply about several months out. And we would not focus on the issue of the week or the day. The whole purpose of the meeting is what's coming several months out that we should start working on now to be ready for it. Okay, third recommendation, know the mechanics of the process. I mentioned earlier that the bureaucracy in the Department of Defense is extraordinarily complicated because of the sophistication of its mission. Don't go in there and try to pull out the Jenga piece and think that this is all okay, or that what you're seeing is all there is. You need to have folks who are technically competent and sound to be able to do this, whether you're doing acquisition, logistics, if it's the audit, it's CPA and audit experience. You know, at Operation Warp Speed, they bought in Moncef Solari. Why? Because he had 29 years worth of making vaccines. He had done it 14 times. He knew what he was doing, in that area. So make sure you surround yourself with people who are subject matter experts on the thing you're trying to take on. Because at the end of the day, as Peter points out, if it was easy, we already would have done it. It's hard. All the things we're taking on are technically hard and need that sort of focus. Fourth is have a schedule and a plan. You don't have to make these public. You don't have to be held accountable to where I told you I was going to do it in a month, but you need to know whether you're on schedule or not. You need to know what things can happen simultaneously and what things are sequential. At DHS, we called it the ICAFER playbook, where who's going to do what by when. We used to joke, if you have a meeting and you don't come out knowing who's going to what by when, you just had coffee. You didn't actually get anything done. So make sure you hold yourself accountable. At Vanna, they have a bullseye chart, each of the different domains and how they could use the data in their stage of, is the data there? Do I have access to it? Is it in? Do they have the answers to the questions they're trying to solve? Is it being used? And each time you can see the progress, which gets to the next one, measure the progress. You want to make sure your team's happy working on the project, be able to tell them the progress. You want your outside supporters to stay with you, show them the progress. There's nothing worse than undergoing a major reform and somebody said, did it save money? I don't know. I didn't know how much the old one cost. Is it more efficient? I don't know. We didn't time how long the old one was. Okay. Start by measuring the thing you're trying to change so that you, when you get to the other side, you can show people how the world is a better place. So we did this with the financial statement audit. We had a series of measures we used, but cheerfully, we were able to get quickly through that because the findings from the field were so self-evident. I was always worried you run the risk you do an audit and people think it's a paper drill. Except when the first thing the auditors found was that the 5% of the buildings that the Navy had on their property books did not exist. They had been knocked down years before. And yet the Navy was allocating budgets and everything and assuming square footage as if those buildings were there. And they weren't. The Army had the opposite problem. The Army had buildings on its books that the auditors said really are condemned. And from a financial statement point of view, you can't consider them real buildings because you'd never put a human being in them safely. So the Army had to knock theirs down. The Navy had to update their books. When somebody's talking about like a base realignment and closure, they're using the DoD property database to make this decision. If that database is off by 5%, you have a very high risk of making major policy decisions on bad data. So when I get to the point of, even if it's not perfect yet, getting those things fixed, everything you fix. I mean, you're never going to get a clean opinion until absolutely everything in the Department of Defense gets a clean opinion. But I'll tell you, I used to have this speech when I was at Homeland Security and people say, DHS was never going to get a clean opinion. I said, that's fine. Let's just get better. Let's get one more part of DHS to the right place. DHS had a clean opinion for what, 5, 6 years now going and still running? Even higher? Okay. See, they've been away for a while. So they have people there who've never heard it any other way, right? And they take it for granted. Whereas when I was there, it was this insurmountable hurdle that no one was ever going to achieve. So what are some of the things we noticed with the DoD audit? Well, the Navy found $3.4 billion worth of inventory that wasn't in its inventory system, 2.7 billion of which it was able to reuse. The other part was for pieces of equipment we don't fly or use anymore. The Department of Defense doesn't use anymore, and yet it was taking up warehouse space, occupying. The Army's had their 39 Black Hawk helicopters, Hill Air Force Base, $53 million in missile motors that if you looked at the database said they weren't usable, but if you went out and looked at them, as the auditors do, it was in perfect working condition, saved us $53 million. DLA closed 59,000 back orders with 287 million. IT security, most people don't even think of this as part of the audit, but one of the questions the auditors ask is, if we wanted to get into your system and mess with your financial statement by getting into your logistics system, your payroll system, could we? Now, the truth is they're not getting into our system to mess with the financial statements, but if they can get into the system, they can get to other things. As was mentioned earlier, those are half the findings, cybersecurity vulnerabilities. That makes the audit worth it just for that, just for people to fix the security of our logistics and our pay systems. But we go on, we had V-22s that were not flyable because they were waiting on a spare part, a series of rollers. What the Navy didn't know was they had those rollers in inventory at a different base who had never put it into the property system or the inventory system, so no one could see it. So we had readiness problems because people couldn't see where the spare parts were for what they needed because somebody hadn't loaded it in. And then we had the dormant account reviews, a way of looking through the budget, where the money is and where it's, normally you have a single set sheet, so you can look and see what a percent obligated is. With the modern system, you can see every single transaction. You can see how long ago it happened. You can do search queries like, show me a budget line that hasn't had any activity in 3 months. And then you can focus on those. So you put much more powerful tools at the hands of the analysts to guide change. And what you find when you do and talk about measuring progress is the logistics community, the CI community, all of them could see the benefit to their operations of this mission. And so we had that support. Okay, it's lovely. You've measured your progress. You're able to tell the people you still need a champion. If you're going to drive change in an organization, you need a champion to help you out. Your boss, the secretary, somebody above you. When I was at DHS, it was the secretary and the IG. If it's a really big change, you absolutely need the Hill. You absolutely need the Hill. As Peter Levine points out in his book, legislation alone is not enough. If you do that, it's like pushing spaghetti. You can tell the department, but you need somebody pulling. But in a lot of cases, it's a prerequisite. If you don't have, if they're writing even report language that reminds everybody in the department they care about what's happening, it makes the reform easier. I had an advantage because the Hill was adamant about this. And I had a senator who made a point to me of saying, you know, if there's anyone who doesn't think the audit's a good idea, I'm happy to meet with them and they can explain it to me. And I offered that to many people when I was in the department. I said, look, if you don't think this is useful, let's you and I go meet with the senator and you can tell him why you don't think this is a good idea. And no one took me up on that, curiously enough. But you will need that champion for change. Later in your career, you may be that champion. Like I started out in DHS and I did the audit there and we got, you know, and I had support of the secretary. I went to DOD, I had the support of the secretary and huge support from the Hill and Nick Mulvaney from the White House. And then I became the deputy secretary and I became the advocate for Advana to support them and to show that we were going to use it inside our DMAGs and therefore everyone better take seriously the data they're giving them because they were going to be used. Operation Warp Speed, Secretary Esper, Secretary Azar, everyone knew that they had their support. If Operation Warp Speed asked for something, they got it. All right, seventh and last one, transition. You have to assume this is going to take longer than your tenure. If you're driving a serious change, it's going to outlast you for all the reasons that we've talked about before. When I was at Homeland Security, the woman I hired to be my head of accounting and then made my deputy, the Obama administration made her the next CFO. And she drove the change all the way and then she departed. And after her departure, in came one more gentleman, an Air Force colonel, who within a month got the clean opinion. And his action was, I don't see why this is so hard. I've been here 30 days. We got clean opinion. Just took the department 10 years. He just came at the end. DoD Advana, the tool is in the hands of the undersecretaries. It's being used. Deputy Secretary Hicks's team is going to be able to take that to a completely different level. We got it so far and it's going to go. Mike McCord and I sort of played back and forth. He handed it to me. I then handed it back to him as the new comptroller. And so you have to assume it's going to take longer than you've got. So you've got to make sure you support, but you've got to make sure there are people in place with the skill sets and the machinery to keep driving that change going forward. So the short answer at the end is yes, management reform is hard, but it's still worth doing if you do it right. And the rules are ask a lot of questions, scout out the obstacles, know the mechanics of the process you're trying to change, have a schedule and a plan, measure progress. So make sure you have a champion for your change and make sure you've planned for the transition. And so with that, I will pause on my remarks and open it up to any questions you have on this, PPBS, the audit, other things that we've discussed since the beginning of today. Yes, no, I recognize. I'll repeat the questions since they'll probably be off mic. All right. Are you going to call the questions for me? Oh, I can. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, sir. When we developed the Donna, it was for the audit, based on financial information that you've described very well. Secretary Work this morning mentioned Secretary Hicks' decisions coming up relative to the chief data officer setting up a new organization. Our thought process when we established it was well placed under control, because there's so many applications that's gone beyond just financial. Is control still the best place in your judgment?
So I think what you have to look at is what is the effect on the data of the different places you put it. And so I'll put two things here. One is whoever has the data is responsible for the audit. So if it goes to a different office, they are the lead for the financial statement audit because that's the system that underlies it. So whoever gets it has to know what they've just owned. The question of can you get a clean opinion becomes theirs. The second part is by being in the accounting part of comptroller, the central focus of it is the accuracy of the data. They don't actually, they make it available to everybody else in the department, but they're only consumers of a piece of it. In general, I think that's what you want. Now, that may be different if you get to the part of the department that's not business, that's sort of the warfighting side that's not that. But I think the chief data officer and others can set up the guidelines and the rules around data structure, how data should be made available, who should have access to it. Those are fine. But I think you want it in a place where the accountability and the accuracy is constantly reinforced, which is why I think where it was housed is the right place. Now, the fact that there are other people interested is just a sign of success, and that's awesome. Go ahead.
Shouldn't it be the responsibility of the IG community to check on existence and completeness for inventory and assets? I mean, does it make sense to pay financial statement auditors to do what the IG should be doing?
So, okay, so I realized I failed on my very first task, which was to repeat the question when it was asked. So for those of you who missed, the first question was, where should the Advanta database be housed? The second question is, isn't it the IG's responsibility? And the short answer is yes, the IG is the one who oversees all of the auditors. The question is whether you want folks who have as a profession testing the existence and completeness of inventory across locations around the country, doing existing and completeness, or is it a specialty you want to grow in the IG? They contracted out to others. I think there's a couple of advantages to this. The first is I got tremendous value when I met with the CPA firms and they explained the problem. So for example, I mentioned the issue with the buildings. One of the things they pointed out is, look, here's why you have a problem with inventorying assets. You have a base with thousands of acres. Somebody needs to find a waterhead that's in there. There's no GPS coordinates in the inventory database. So that person would have to wander the base to do existence and completeness. If you would discipline this people to put in as soon as something's built, the GPS coordinates, then updating your property records are very quick. And so they had all of these examples from being in the private sector that very quickly took the problems out of actually doing existence and completeness and other things. So I found that feedback of what they could say about how others solve the problem a much easier path than us trying to solve it ourselves. Other questions from this room or any from online? Go ahead. Yes.
Thanks. Curious what your thoughts are on the now codified practice of Congress receiving unfunded priority lists, or UPLs, which are somewhat become regularly congressionally approved over the years. As you're aware, this is outside of the president's budget requests, and this can be significant amounts of money. How do you see that factoring into defense management reform?
So my views on the UPLs list depend on where I'm sitting and the politics of the moment. So if I'm in one of the places gets to submit them, I'm really fond of them. When I was a Hill staffer, they were very useful to have. When you're in the department and you've made tough trade-off choices, you tend to get a little unhappy that someone's going around you. Now, the Congress asked them for it, so it's not as if any of these people are misbehaving. And if I didn't repeat the question, I may have failed. The question is unfinanced priority lists that come from the commands and from the services to the Hill at the Hill's request. What's sort of the view? This gets back to the basic question of whether it's explicit or whether people are doing it without saying it explicitly. The Hill will hear what the trade-offs and the choices were that the department made, and some of them will get relitigated. So I have liked it or not liked it to where it affected me, but I think at the end of the day, if you're in leadership and you made a decision, you have to be able to go to the Hill and explain why you funded A over B. And normally the services are pretty good about saying, if there was more money, I would do X, but I support the department on what they submitted. But it just presents to the Hill, here's the trade-offs. Asif.
The position of the CMO has finally gone. It went through several or a few different iterations over the last 12 years or something. Peter was one of them. My question is, I mean, is that a position which was felt at the department which is necessary or important for reform? I mean, fully realizing that most of the functions will move to this controller position and some to others. Any thoughts on that?
So the question that I was asked is about the CMO and the role of it in the Department of Defense. And when I was deputy, I read through a series of reports, GEO and otherwise, that looked at, I think, the Hill examined every single possible variation of this flavor of ice cream, right? DCMOs, CMOs, it was in comptroller actually at one point, had a different type of name. And each time there's a question of, if we put it in a different place, would it function differently? And what it ended up as its own office, what we found was it was effective as an advocate for reform, on speaking on behalf of it. But when you looked at where were the major changes happening in the department, I talked about background investigations. There's a significant drop in the backlog of background investigations, and there's a move to the concept of continuous vetting. That's being led by INS, right? Because they're the owners of that process. Acquisition did the adaptive acquisition framework. So they adapted a new process for acquisition, engaged with the Hill. They were the lead for that. The Army was the lead for night court, comptroller for the audit, the CIO for data center consolidation. So what we found was reforms tended to happen inside a functional area when led by the head of that functional area with an expertise in that domain and the ability to drive that change. And so having a separate office, you either ended up signaling to people reform is not your job, which is a huge mistake, right? Or you have somebody who's trying to figure out how to tell the experts how to drive the change. What Deputy Secretary Hicks has done in her memo, which I think is consistent and right, is she put a lot of the, recreated A&M, which is the right thing to do, move the things back to comptroller and CAPE that belong there. But at the end of the day, what the department needs, what the Deputy Secretary needs, is a trusted agent who they can say, go and engage the undersecretaries, go and engage the defense agencies, see what they're using to measure performance, and tell me whether or not you think they're taking on meaningful changes or whether I, as the deputy, need to intervene. So that's what she set up when she's brought in Mike Donnelly, right, as the director of A&M. Now, the truth is, he could have any job title, but because everyone knows that he is trusted by her, that he knows the department, he's competent and experienced, then he can be her representative. He happens to be in A&M, which is a fine place. It gives him a great deal of visibility. But the truth is, it's the relationship between the deputy secretary, who generally in most divisions of labor has the inside the building function of the secretary, the outside the building, and who that advocate is. And if that relationship is good, it doesn't really matter what their title is. They can drive that set of change. So I'm very supportive of what she has done. I think she's made a good priority and an emphasis. We've talked a lot about her emphasis on data and her emphasis on here of giving him the mantle of PIO. And if someone came after her and moved the PIO to a different office, I don't know that I'd mind. The question is, who's got that connection and is able to be that leader that people recognize is driving the meeting for the deputy? Dr. Chu.
You suggested your remarks that the biggest transition facing defense is giving the But as you know, that's been the mantra for more than 2 presidential terms. And the critics would argue very little has changed in our posture Pacific meantime, and very little has changed in our investment portfolio. So 2-part question. One, do you think Chris is fair? And if it is fair, what would you do differently about how the fire is managed and led to make more progress in the next?
So I think the answer, what I would say is the department has changed, but the argument hasn't changed as fast or as far as necessary. And I don't think it is the case, but when I was in the department, they came out with the National Defense Strategy, there were clear investments, long-range strike, hypersonics, the focus on the things that recognize the sheer scale of the Pacific, right? When you're fighting in the Pacific, the ranges that you have to operate in. So we previously were bound by the INF treaty on the range of ground-based missiles. Well, if you had a missile of a 500-kilometer range in the Pacific, you're just hitting water. I mean, there's nothing. So you need to be able to get out of that to be able to produce missiles that can go thousands of kilometers, which now we can. And so there's a series of those investments at the R&D level to give us long-range strike capability that I all think in the right direction. There's an emphasis on doing more with Navy, particularly with submarines, given the nature of the Pacific. The challenge has always been, and fair enough to the Army, which is if I have to rotate 3 to 1 in the Middle East, you really can't draw down the Army force structure, which is one of the things you would do to increase investment in long-range strike or in shipbuilding. When you get past that point, when you're able to make those decisions, you can free some of those resources up. So I think there has been change in the right direction, as many people do. You decide it's not as quick as we would like, but some of that is also these new technologies are under development, but they're not at the fielding stage. And as I was leaving, there was a number getting close, and that's what we started to put in the budget. But it's hard to really drop a major investment on prototypes until you can really get to the quantity and scale that you need. Yes, and if there's any online, feel free to tell me.
Data has been a unifying theme today, including your remarks, and we talked about I'm seeing a disconnect there, and maybe this is a timing thing, but we're doing work for a military department that would be very familiar to you, on airplanes that would be very familiar to you, and there's all sorts of problems with not buying parts we should be buying and having a lot of parts and buying parts that we already have too many of. And as we peel back that onion, there's data problems all over the place, openized data systems, contradictory data systems, inaccurate data systems, lots of names. And so our people have worked with that whole department. I don't believe the word Ivana has ever been mentioned to them. So at the working level, I don't think we're seeing it.
So the question is, first it was about the emphasis on data as a theme, and then an example was being given about an unnamed Air Force program where they had challenges ordering the right number of parts, ordering too much of the wrong one and less of the other, and that those folks who were using it weren't necessarily using Advana. So the short answer is, if they were using the system Advana draws from, because what Advana does is it reaches into the system of record. So it doesn't do personnel transactions, but it goes to the personnel transaction system and pulls from it. The HR people might be using the underlying system. So these folks may have been using the actual inventory system that Advana was pulling from and that the auditors were testing. And so what the auditors would be pointing out is what is in your inventory doesn't match what's in your system and bringing an emphasis on fixing it. And Advana would be helping to show that type of challenge. But what you point out is with each of these, what happens with data is when you shine the light on it and you start making it clear to people the disconnect between what is in their system and what is truth, they understand the operational impact, the disruption to their mission from buying the wrong thing. And the answer is, okay, now this is your opportunity to drive change in a bureaucracy, follow steps 1 through 7. Why did we get into this position? Why is it that there's either multiple places by which to enter data or the system is incomplete? And can we fix that, right? And it creates the incentive and the drive to try and resolve that process.
I have 2 other questions for you, both on Advana. So the first one, hopefully you can answer relatively quickly. Who has access to the data? How can the data help support the CAPE program review?
Mm-hmm. So the answer on who has access, and I'll be a little bit careful here because there's a tiered set of access, right? Not everyone in the department can get everything in Advana. There has to be a relevance to the mission, and there's a classified and unclassified piece. But legitimate users have access to Advana by going through the comptroller's office and getting log-on and user IDs and so forth. And I believe that CAPE is one of those. I mean, there's language from the Department of, from the Congress that says you will make this data available. And so part of the mission to the Advana team is making it available to CAPE and others for them to do their data analytics.
The second question is one we had earlier, but didn't get an answer to, and I think it's probably fairly asked to you since you've been so heavily engaged in this, but let me know if this, if you know, have you heard if the DoD is looking to move to a data brokering service or data mesh akin to what Jeff Bezos set up at Amazon with his Bezos mandate instead of data lakes like Advantage? Is that something that has been considered as you move forward here?
So let me walk through it. Here's my understanding of data mesh. The question is, did we look at using data mesh instead of a data? They can hear you? Okay, good. By the time we get this to the end, I'll be really good at this. So the issue, as I understand it with data mesh, is in data mesh, instead of data, Advantage is a data lake, which means it goes to the underlying system, pulls it into a central database and says, everyone look here for do your analysis. Data mesh is when you go out to the underlying systems and draw from them directly. And so you don't have to have this second piece of information. That's my understanding of the difference. Here is why we didn't do data mesh originally. The first is there was a huge organizational resistance to the idea that someone else was going to come into your system and potentially touch the data. And so by explaining to people, we're only going to take a mirror copy, and therefore, in order to make the data usable, we had to, the Advantage folks had to reformat it into different styles so that it had all the right fields and could fix some of the challenges. They didn't want anyone touching their system. So I think if we had tried to advocate for, we're going to let people throughout the department from different places come and tap your system, potentially overloading your capacity because some of these systems don't have a lot of bandwidth to get to them. They're housed in a certain place. We would have lost that support and potentially taken down those systems. Now, in the long run, could one get to data mesh? Potentially, but then you'd have to have the underlying system formatted in the right way and readily accessible, which is possible if you have a lot of modern standard systems. But given the stovepipe nature of the department, I suspect it would be a while before they would be attempting to take that leap, given the challenges logistically that would create and how much the data gets formatted to get it correctly when it comes into Advantage. Yes.
I have one more question about data. I'm curious, you obviously engaged a lot of efforts to improve the completeness of data. I'm curious when there are issues with bias or uncertainty, how you convey information to them before it's incomplete.
So the question is on data, what do you do about if it's incomplete data? How do you convey the uncertainty? And so this is an important one, which is there's a risk of looking at data and assuming all the decimal points are conveying real information. And so depending on the topic is whether or not somebody said, how many carriers do you have? You're pretty certain it ends in a .0, right? There's an exact number. But some other things, the answers get so, well, somebody's going to bring up construction in progress, so fair enough. Always one. But for other ones, there's an uncertainty range, right? And trying to deal with that. And in some cases, we plot those on the chart, either uncertainty because of historical averages or uncertainty in terms of the range of data we're getting in. We also are very clear to folks early on, these are audited, but they haven't passed the audit. So a lot of the data you look at, we want to get to the point, the department wants to get to the point now that you can have a logo in the lower corner that would indicate where the data came from and whether it did okay in the audit. So you'd start to see this came from a system who passed the audit. This came from a system that failed the accuracy of the audit. So you would actually be warning your readers about the quality of the underlying system. And then anyone who owned that system could feel appropriately embarrassed in the meeting that the system that's being drawn from that they're responsible for is viewed as unreliable and be able to bring it up to standard. We good for time?
I think we're good. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I'll point out as we conclude here, it took me 2 years to come up with 10 rules for defense management reform. It apparently took Dave about 2 weeks to come up with 7. But I think they're additive and people might want to look at 17 rules of defense management reform now, and that makes the point. It's not easy. So thank you very much, Dave.
Well, and for those of you, if you haven't read his article on this, I'd encourage you to do it. I think what you'll see is he's giving you 10 rules that apply when you're looking at it. My favorite one is no one gets to start with a clean slate, which is one of the first mistakes. Mine actually are really, if you're going to implement it, mechanic steps and guiding. So once you've read his and you're not spooked, then you take mine when you go and try and run into the football. But thank you all for being here. Thank you for online. Let me turn it back to you. Oh, absolutely. Thank you.
Folks, we're all done for the day. I appreciate you're all being so patient with this. And just one more word before we conclude. I want to thank Tina Patterson, who's in the back corner there. None of this would have happened without her efforts. So thank you, Tina.